touched on this with Sam and Izzy as well, but the amount of single parent households is like some absurdly high number. I know you were talking about generational the generational like symptoms of that. You want to elaborate on that?
So understanding that, and as you touched on how when you have police either being the one to incarcerate black men or kill them in the ways that they do, it leaves a gap in a child's life.
Right.
And that's not necessarily something that you have to think too hard about. It's a simple understanding.
Right.
You understand that when a piece of the family unit is missing, it then creates a generational issue, or can create a generational issue. I'm not saying it's guaranteed, but it's easily to see
the likelihood is higher.
Yeah, the likelihood is higher because they don't have what does it look like to have two parents who are there to support you when you need them, who are there to support you financially, and there to help guide you when you come across things. If you have now had one who's been incarcerated for, let's say for a charge that may or may not have been a violent charge, and they've been put away for long periods of time.
Yeah.
You now have a perspective of the government that has now taken your dad away.
Right.
You know what I mean? So then you kind of grow up with either with that resentment, or if your mom is working 2 or 3 jobs to try and provide for you, you're then kind of navigating through that life on your own. You're not. You don't have anyone there to then help shape you and help teach you. All right, this is what you got to do when you get into these type of situations.
Right.
Making sure that you're good when you come across that. So when you have a child grow up like that in that type of environment, it's easy to see how it's the stereotype of, this kid is a problem child. He has anger issues, or he has issues with this. Well, he doesn't have anyone in his home to help him with those issues. Right. You know what I mean? Understand that you're looking at the symptom of what the problem is, rather than what the problem is itself.
Yeah. There's also an interesting biological standpoint to that. It's like when I was listening to a podcast, and it was a biologist was talking about when you take a large portion of the males out of any given population, the males who are left become in higher demand from a mating perspective, and then they don't have the incentive to stick around and create that family structure that you were talking about. So not only is it they're incarcerated, but the ones who are left have less of an incentive to stick around because they're in higher biological demand by the females of that community. And that's, from what biologists were saying, that's across the board. If you take a large portion of the males out of any community, that's kind of what happens. So that is compounded on top of the fact that they're growing up without dads and they don't have the role models, and then they do the same thing of either they get jailed or killed, and then the ones who are left, it's just the cycle repeats itself, and the opportunities to get out aren't there and won't be there until that's addressed, which is...
And at face value, that does make sense. And as you were explaining it earlier, it made sense. But I don't know, hearing it again, it feels like, and the fact of the matter is it a fact? Yes. But when you're trying to understand it and look at it from...
It's a compounding factor. It's not the only factor. It's a compounding one. And
the podcast, the fact that he mentioned it made sense, and I expressed this to you when we talked earlier. I don't think that's necessarily what should be focused on. No. Granted, is it a fact? Maybe. Yes, it could be a fact.
Yeah, I agree. It shouldn't be the focus, but to understand why it's so bad, that needs to be understood as it's not just stop jailing. It's stop jailing, and then it'll take a generation or two for this biological thing to also kind of come out of this, out of the population or the community. So it's like you do this one thing, and people are like you do police reform, and it doesn't change for a generation or two. People are like,
people
why?
Argue it doesn't work.
People are like, oh, well, it didn't work. It's like, okay, well, this other thing needs to be considered as well. Should it be the main focus? No. Should it be talked about, though? I would argue yes, due to that fact. Especially because if people don't see change immediately, then it's like, well, it didn't work anyway, so like, why did you even do it? It's like, well, no, just like patience, like let it kind of. That's so it's an important kind of anecdote, I feel like, to that issue. It's something that I hadn't considered before. But yeah, like you said, that it shouldn't be the main focus to the single parent household issue. Shouldn't be the main focus at all, but it is an important part of the issue nonetheless.
I'd be curious to see what
opinion,
percentage, or if you could even factor out a percentage for that, of what type of, like, how that actually contributes to the greater discussion at hand.
I'm sure there's studies done about, like, not within this particular one, but if you pull a group of males out of the population, what happens to the kids of any mammal species, probably, or any species where both parents are involved in the raising of the child or offspring or whatever. I feel like there are studies done on.
I feel like that's difficult though if it's not a human.
Yeah, it's different. It's different for sure. Different. Humans is different
because it's one thing to just pull them out, but it's also when you're talking about humans, when you're talking about black people, how are you pulling them out?
Yeah,
and the ways that they're being pulled out
makes it worse than
not necessarily makes it worse. That's the key issue. Because if you're talking about mass incarceration on a scale that on basis that's either nonviolent offenses or the 3-strike laws in California, or even just
drug
being
offenses
killed.
Or whatever. Yeah.
Yes, that then leaves an impact. The fact that how they get pulled out of the structure, I guess you can call it society, as you say.
Yeah. So
the way they're being pulled out is the issue at hand. Not necessarily, okay, they're getting pulled out, now there's, one male for every 4 women. Now it's easier for him to, to go have sex with each one of these women and then have kids, and then now he gets to pick which one he wants to go to. It's bigger than that in the sense.
It is. Definitely.
Yeah.
It is definitely bigger. I'm not trying to take away from the initial issue at hand, but yeah. Okay. So,
but when you see it from that perspective as, let's say if there was an equal amount for each one, and, in an ideal world there should be. You shouldn't have to have, disproportionately more African American males going to jail or being killed by police than there are any other kinds. But that's where we live in. So when you see it from that perspective, and instead of understanding, and from this gentleman's perspective, and I'm going to say he's a biologist, so let's see what he would look at. But when you look at it from the perspective of,
evolutionary biologist.
Yeah.
Specifically. It's a little twist onto, like, how people evolve and how their, like, the instincts evolve rather than just, it's a nuance. But
I'd be curious to ask him if he sees it from the perspective I'm trying to explain it from, or if is his only focus on specifically the biological standpoint of it.
And for everybody who doesn't know what we're talking about, Brett Weinstein was on Joe Rogan's podcast like 3 or 4 days ago. He brought up a couple of very interesting points. A couple of those were, one I just brought up with Jason, but I wanted to know what his thoughts were on that. I don't want to speak for him, but I would venture to guess that his point would be, so many people are already talking about that, and no one is talking about
his perspective,
the biological part, and so it's important to bring it up. Would be my guess. Would be how he would respond. Obviously, I'm not trying to put words in his mouth, but I've heard what you're saying way more. Like, I've heard what you're saying from multiple people, like all different like places. People who understand how the cycle works. That's the first time I've heard that
perspective.
Yeah,
and it is a different perspective. Definitely a different perspective.
It's almost like a supplement.
Yeah, but it's based on fact. As you can say, it is based on fact. What contributing factor does that fact have? I don't know.
No,
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if there is research on that, but from at face value, it is kind of, and this is kind of where my responses come from. Is may it be true? Yes, and we've said this as well. May it be true? Yes, but is that the focus of what we are focused on now?
No.
Not necessarily.
Yeah,
it still is fact.
Yeah.
So
definitely, and he brought up another good point about biological systems within the brain, that like the instincts that lead to how human beings can take any terrestrial like environment and use it to their advantage. And what he was talking about with the slave trade was you were taking people out of their ancestral environment, taking them out of their culture, thrusting them into a new, different environment. So all of what they had known before no longer applied. They had no common culture because they mixed people from all different places in Africa. As far as like, they didn't keep all the people from like Ghana together or Cote d'Ivoire together. It was all mixed up. So there was no common culture. So then they had to make their own, and that set them back biologically as well. And that was another point that I hadn't considered from, like, yes, did all the atrocities happen to where at face value, okay, they didn't have the money, they didn't have the generational wealth or the access to education or that, but it set them back
Argumentally.
More than mentally, because we were talking about before about how if you're taught so often that like people don't like how you look, you're talking about how people in like the 30s would use like chemicals on their hair to make it straight or whatever. But it's even deeper than that. It's like your instincts, your deepest instincts at your core were taken away from you. And that is far worse than what, like, not to say that the other stuff isn't bad, because it's horrible. That's far worse than that. Your deepest instincts no longer apply. And that is a horrible, horrible thing to take away from a group of people, especially like the Black community and Native Americans, to take like groups that reside on the East Coast and stick them on the West Coast and like with nothing. It's a horrible, horrible thing.